On October 19th, 1891, the first hard frost took Coldwater before dawn, laying a pale crust across water barrels, wagon tongues, and the hitching rail in front of Gideon Pemberton's store. And by sunrise, the air stood at 21 degrees with a stillness that made every shovel strike sound farther than it was. The town ledger, kept in a cracked leather book in the council room, listed 286 souls that morning, and each of those souls woke to the same sharp breath and the same early judgment. Winter had come with intent. By mid-morning, when smoke from cook stoves rose in thin vertical lines and did not drift, a buckskin mare stepped down the north road, pulling the first of two freight wagons loaded not with furniture or timber, but with crates of glass jars nested in straw. The woman walking beside that mare held the lead rope in a gloved hand, shoulders set, eyes level, and did not turn when the first porch voice said her name. Ray Jennings had returned to Coldwater at 38 years of age, 20 years after the town had told her to leave. On porch planks and along the boardwalk, voices followed her anyway, low at first and then bolder as certainty returned to familiar mouths. Some remembered the church quarrel and smirked as if time had settled it for good. Others watched the jar crates and said nothing, measuring the frost instead of the woman. By noon, her return had crossed every stove circle in Coldwater, carrying more speculation than fact. At 18, Ray had stood in the same church aisle where she now passed in silence and argued that shallow root pits, loose-lidded grain bins, and winter boasting would take lives when rail schedules failed. She had been a farmer's daughter then, narrow with youth, speaking with the hard certainty of practical arithmetic in a room that preferred reassurance. The older men had called her ungrateful. The younger ones had called her fearful. One councilman had said that a town built on progress should not take instruction from a girl smelling of brine and smoke. Her father had died the previous spring under a wagon wheel outside Ogallala. Her mother had taken in sewing until her lungs failed in the dust years, and Ray had gone west with a single trunk, 2 knives, and methods that had come down to her through 3 hands at once. Her grandmother, Eliza Crow Jennings, had come out of Tennessee hill country and preserved as if each jar were a promise made to a grave. She taught salt by ratio, not guesswork. 1 ounce of coarse salt to each quart of cabbage in cool weather. A little more when nights ran warm, never trusting a handful when a scale could tell the truth. Her mother, Miriam, taught her fermentation by smell and patience, and taught her to score lids, boil cloth, and keep ash away from cooling seals. An uncle by marriage, old Harlan Pike, had ridden freight camps and trap lines and showed her smoke curing by wind direction, not flame size, hanging rabbit and antelope where draft moved steady and thin from west to east, never where eddies would sour the fat. In one sentence, he gave her the rule she carried longer than any prayer: preserve for 6 months when the market promises 2 weeks. Between 1871 and 1891, Ray worked country that did not forgive waste. She cooked for rail crews near Laramie one season, sorted freight tins in North Platte another, and kept boarding camp stores in 2 mining settlements where winter cut mule traffic for 30 and 40 days at a stretch. She saw coal run out while money stayed in pockets with nowhere to buy food. She saw men with full pay envelopes trade watches for 1 sack of oats. She saw a foreman die not from a wound, but from fever after cough syrup froze in its bottle because no one had thought to keep medicine below frost line. In those years, she learned to read scarcity before it arrived. She bought jars whenever wages permitted, 1 crate at a time, then 2, then 10. She paid attention to earth temperatures, to how far down frost traveled in different soils, to which timbers warped least in damp chambers, and to what happened when proud settlements believed railroad timetables were weatherproof. By the 3rd week of October, as cold settled into the draws west of town, Ray had already asked 3 survey questions before she purchased so much as a nail. Depth to stable moisture, slope for runoff, and wind exposure in January. The parcel she chose lay outside cold water, proper on alkali ground no rancher wanted, a narrow strip broken with salt grass and white crust patches where oats would fail, and kitchen gardens turned bitter. She paid $41 in cash to Amos Lind, who signed the transfer with visible relief, and she told no one she considered that ground superior because no one would compete for it, and because the rise at its eastern edge offered drainage and concealment both. When Gideon heard of the purchase, he laughed from the store steps in broadcloth coat and calfskin gloves and asked loud enough for teamsters and schoolboys to hear whether Ray meant to bury herself with her jars before snow came. By afternoon, he had given the project a name that traveled faster than the mail: Ray's Grave. Gideon Pemberton was 46, broad through the middle, barbered every Saturday, and prosperous in the visible way frontier wealth announced itself, with polished boots, imported cuff buttons, and a ledger that decided who ate on credit and who did not. His store was Coldwater's single commercial spine, 2 stories of flour barrels, lamp oil, seed stock, patent remedies, and gossip, and for 12 years he had occupied the space where trade and authority blended until most souls no longer separated one from the other. He did not shout often. He did not need to. When he said no decent town lived like moles while shelves stood full, heads nodded in the doorway. When he added that fear was bad for commerce, 3 councilmen repeated it before sunset, as if they had coined it. Ray answered with measurements. She marked a rectangle 46 feet by 22 feet on the alkali strip with stakes cut from cottonwood saplings and twine rubbed in charcoal so lines held visible in dawn light. She hired 2-day laborers at $1.35 each for the first week, then released them when their joking slowed production and continued with one steady hand, Marta Quill, a widow who had hauled stone for railroad bridges and asked no unnecessary questions. They cut through top crust with mattock and spade, set spoil in berms to the north and west as future windbreak, and dug to 12 feet where soil shifted from brittle tan to dense, cool brown. Ray paid $7 for salvaged limestone blocks from a collapsed kiln west of town, $3.10 for clay cartage, and 92 cents for straw bundles from Boone acreage. She counted every expense in a narrow notebook wrapped in oilcloth. The chamber floor was tamped in 3 lifts of gravel and clay, each wetted and compacted with a hand ram until boot heels left no impression. Walls went up dry stacked first, then chinked from both sides with clay straw mortar pressed by palm and trowel into each seam. Ray insisted on a wall thickness of 28 inches, not from habit but from thermal arithmetic. Enough mass to take in stove heat slowly, enough volume to release it through the night when fuel burned low. She set cedar uprights at 8-foot intervals, each post charred lightly at the base before burial to resist rot, and laid crossbeams with a shallow arch, so roof load would transfer into sidewalls rather than sag at center. Above that arch, she laid brush, then a hide sheet, then 18 inches of packed earth, graded to shed meltwater. Marta called it overbuilt. Ray said overbuilt was another word for winter ready. Ventilation received the same discipline as stonework. One shaft rose on the leeward side to draw stale air out, capped with a slotted iron hood Ray had traded for from a blacksmith in Sydney. A second shaft entered lower on the opposite wall through a buried intake lined with plank and mesh, designed to temper incoming air through soil before it reached sleeping level. She tested draft with a tallow candle every evening, recording flame lean and smoke lift in her notebook beside weather entries. Wind northwest at dusk, 14 miles by vane estimate. Frost depth 4 inches at pump lot. Creek margin icing. On fair days, children stood at the edge and counted jar crates as she lowered them by rope cradle, then ran back to town saying Ray Jennings was building a tomb for Beans. She did not answer the children. She did not answer Gideon when he rode past, and said she had dug herself a proper grave at last. Late each night she washed clay from her hands in water that skinned over with ice, fed the buckskin mare a measured ration of hay and beet tops, and stacked another row of jars in straw-lined racks against the north wall where temperature held steady. Beans, beets, turnips, venison, rabbit, and choke cherry preserved took their places in ordered rows. Salt croaks were elevated on timber slats to keep brine cool and clean. A hanging rail for smoked meat ran the length of the East Bay, set high enough for airflow and low enough for inspection by lantern. By November 2nd, the first chamber was not finished, but it was functioning, and functional mattered more than appearance. Coldwater continued with autumn habits. Wagons came and went. Gideon sold coffee and confidence in equal measure. Church bells marked Sundays. Yet each evening, as light withdrew behind the cottonwoods and the frost returned to the ruts, more souls slowed their walk past the alkali strip and looked down into the deepening earthwork with expressions that mixed ridicule, curiosity, and a reluctance they had not yet named. Ray kept working at first light and last light, her pace unchanged, her ledger exact, building for a winter she believed would test the difference between full shelves and real preparation. The watching did not stop when dusk came. It merely changed shape, becoming silhouettes at the berm edge and quiet remarks carried in breath that smoked white in the cold, while Ray measured the chamber draft one more time and wrote, by lantern, that the interior held at 48 degrees when the outside air had fallen back to 24. She closed the notebook, banked the small stove, and climbed out with clay on her sleeves, passing 3 men who had come to laugh and remain to stare at the stone thickness in silence. None offered help. None offered obstruction. Coldwater had entered that narrow condition between ridicule and fear. By November 6th, a north wind had stripped most cottonwood leaves in a single afternoon, and Ray began a second intake trench 16 inches below frost line, adding a gravel sump where seepage could collect and be drawn off with hand pump and bucket. Marta Quill asked why she shaped the trench floor with such slight fall, less than 2 inches across 12 feet, and Ray answered with practical patience that standing water became ice, ice became cracked stone, and cracked stone became morning. She spoke without drama, as if reciting seed weight. Marta spat into her glove, lifted the shovel, and said she preferred planning to funerals. That night, Reverend Abel Klein came down the alkali rise wrapped in a coat too thin for the temperature, carrying a lantern whose glass had gone sooted at the top. He stood above the hatch and looked not at Ray but at the rows of jars, the suspended rails, the cedar braces set square as pewbacks. He asked after a long silence whether she had returned to prove Coldwater wrong. Ray laid a lid ring on the table, checked the seal, and said, "I returned because Winter does not care who won an argument 20 years ago." The Reverend removed his hat and held it in both hands, a gesture of respect he did not announce. In the second week of November, she widened the main hall by another 4 feet on the west side, cutting into tougher subsoil where caliche nodules dulled the spade edge, then ordered 40 additional jars from Sydney through a freight broker who charged $6.40 including breakage risk. She paid in coin from a leather purse kept inside her coat lining. She also purchased 2 used cast iron stove sections, one cracked but repairable with wire and clay wrap, and a coil of hemp rope 60 yards long for winter guides. Gideon observed each purchase from his store steps and repeated his line to any soul within earshot that she was building a monument to fear. He added policy to mockery when scarcity first whispered. Flour that had sold for 28 cents per 10-pound sack in September rose to 44 cents on November 8th, then to 60 cents by November 13th. And he blamed freight uncertainty, though rail records at the station still showed ordinary arrivals. Credit narrowed with each increase. Families without deeded acreage or livestock collateral were told to pay coin. One mother left with half a sack and wet eyes because half payment purchased half rations. Gideon called it prudence. Men who depended on his ledger called it unavoidable. The town began to confuse authority with necessity. Ray worked through those price changes as if they were weather, not insult. She put up white beans and navy beans in 480-quart jars over 11 days, using a measured brine at 2.5% salinity for long holding and a lower salt ratio for batches intended for early consumption. Venison came from 2 does traded from a ranch hand for preserved pears and coffee. Rabbit came by snare from Marta's nephews. Antelope sides were purchased at 3 cents per pound from a hunter leaving for Colorado. She smoked each cut in thin blue currants, turning by hook position every 6 hours so fat did not pool and sour. Children resumed their counting game as wagons unloaded. Adults laughed louder because the numbers had grown too large to dismiss quietly. On November the 14th, geese crossed above Cottonwood Creek in ragged, low lines, moving south with urgency uncommon before month's end. And the muskrat lodges along the bank stood higher than Ray had seen in any year she had logged. She walked the creek edge at noon, broke thin bank ice with her boot heel, and measured lodge rise against her cane marks from the previous week. The increase was nearly 5 inches. She said nothing there. She went straight to the church and asked for speaking time after evening hymn. Cold water gathered under lamplight with 173 souls present by door count, coats damp at the hem from frozen mud. Reverend Klein introduced Ray without flourish. She stepped to the aisle front, removed her gloves, and laid 3 facts before them. Geese 3 weeks early, muskrat houses built high against flood and freeze, and a pressure fall she had tracked over 6 mornings that suggested a hard pattern setting in before Christmas. She said rail confidence was not food, and pride was not fuel. She asked the council to authorize a shared emergency cache in her chamber or any secure cellar, with each household contributing according to means and drawing by need if transport failed. Gideon did not wait for a vote. He stood from the third pew, broadcloth neat, gloves tucked at his belt, and answered in a voice trained by years of selling certainty. "Trade is better than panic," he said, turning so all could hear. "Commerce is civilization. We do not answer every wild bird flight by crawling underground like frightened badgers." Several men laughed. One clapped. A councilman moved to table her request until January review, and the motion carried by raised hands before Reverend Klein could ask for further comment. Ray replaced her gloves, nodded once to the room, and walked out into 19-degree dark while the hymn resumed behind her. 3 days passed before the first consequence arrived, and it came with no trumpet. On the morning of November the 17th, a rail rider reached Coldwater with ice in his beard and reported that eastbound track at Platte Crossing had washed out under a sudden surge and then frozen jagged, rails lifted like bent wire above the ties. By afternoon, telegram service failed when 2 poles went down in freezing rain 20 miles east, and the station agent's repeated keying returned only static clicks. He sent one mounted message south. The horse returned near midnight riderless, reins torn, and no written reply was found in the satchel. Coldwater had been cut from flour, coal oil, patent medicines, and replacement parts in less than 1 day. Ray did not call a meeting. She altered the plan. Before sunrise on November 18th, she marked 2 new chamber outlines off the main hall, one for sleeping platforms and one for cold storage, then hired 4 laborers at $1.50 each because urgency had raised wages and she did not bargain. The sleeping chamber was cut 14 by 18 feet, with 2 tiers of plank bunks supported by stone piers. The storage room was smaller and deeper, with sawdust-lined bins for ice blocks harvested once the creek thickened. She extended venting with opposing stovepipes, one high exhaust and one low feed, so heat would circulate instead of collecting at ceiling level. By lamplight, she sketched a rope-guided trench route from town edge to the hatch, planning 20-yard marker stakes for whiteout movement. By the first week of December, the linked chambers had taken shape as a system rather than a shelter, and even those who mocked the intention could not deny the craft. Ray and Marta sealed wall seams with fresh clay and chopped straw mixed at 1 part straw to 4 parts clay by volume, pressing it deep with wooden paddles, then burnished the interior with damp hands to reduce shedding dust. Cedar braces were driven and wedged at load points where roof stress concentrated. A floor drain from the cooking bay emptied into a gravel pit beyond the west berm to prevent interior ice slick. She purchased 12 additional water casks, each 9 gallons, at 78 cents apiece, and rolled them into place on oak skids. Gideon responded to deepening uncertainty by narrowing mercy further. Flour rose to $1.20 per 10-pound sack by December 12th. Coal oil doubled. Salt became scarce enough that he sold in half-pound packets at premium, refusing credit to renters regardless of family size. His shelves still looked full from the door, but empty spaces had begun behind the front barrels, and he turned labels outward to hide the gaps. A widow named Elsie Dorn offered her wedding silver spoon for kerosene. He declined the spoon and accepted only coin. The exchange passed from porch to porch by evening, each retailing a little quieter than the last. Ray answered Price with preservation and schedule. She set ration tallies in charcoal on a board by the chamber entrance: beans, roots, smoked meat, dried apples, salt stock, lamp oil, and water volume, each updated nightly so no decision relied on hope. She cut and stacked ice from Cottonwood Creek once thickness reached 6 inches, packing blocks under sawdust in a pit chamber where temperature held below freezing even during midday sun. She rendered tallow for emergency lamps, stitched wool blankets from salvage, and set hooks by every bunk for drying socks and mittens where heat would rise, but not scorch cloth. A boy from town asked why she made so many small rules. She handed him a coil of twine and said rules were lighter to carry than coffins. On January 6, 1892, under a pale sun that gave no warmth, Ray completed the rope trench from the town edge to her hatch, walls shoulder-high in places where drift had already begun. Guideline taut and knotted at intervals a gloved hand could count without sight. She set branch lines toward the church and schoolhouse, and capped each marker stake with cloth strips soaked in lampblack so they showed against snow. That afternoon, only one family came quietly to ask for storage space: a carpenter named Owen Bell, his wife Ruth, and their 2 daughters carrying sacks of turnips and 3 jars of lard wrapped in feed cloth. Ray weighed the goods, logged the names, and assigned shelf position without ceremony. A beginning had been made. A beginning had been made, and Ray treated that beginning as a contract, not a comfort. She walked Owen Bell and Ruth Bell through the chamber by lantern, showing them where each household mark would be cut into pine tags and wired to shelf fronts, where common stock would be stacked apart from private reserves, and where no one would set wet boots because thaw water would creep under crate legs and spoil whole rows by morning. Owen listened with the careful face of a man who built roofs for a living and recognized a load path when he heard one. Ruth asked only 2 questions, both practical, both sharp: how to keep children from taking food out of order, and how to warm broth without filling the room with smoke. Ray answered by handing her a slate schedule and pointing to the baffle box she had built from scrap tin and fire brick. Nothing in that chamber had been left to chance. On January the 7th, with dawn at 6 degrees and a wind from the northwest, that held steady enough to strip words from mouths, Ray began extending the south side room by another 10 feet, so the Bell girls and other small children could sleep away from the draft zone near the hatch ladder. She and Marta Quill drove new cedar posts at 4-foot centers, each foot set in packed gravel rather than soil, so winter damp would not rot up the grain. They trimmed plank edges to leave a finger-width gap between boards for air movement, then fitted wool screens over the lower intake to catch ash and wind-blown grit. Ray marked the intake and exhaust temperatures 3 times each day on a board by the stove: 18, 24, 31 at the inlet depending on wind, and near 54 by the sleeping platforms after 2 hours of burn. She recorded all of it in the oilcloth notebook at night, adding notes in the margin about smoke draw and condensation along the north wall. By January 8th, she had split the main stores into 4 classes and lettered them with charcoal and lampblack: immediate rations, reserve rations, medicine stock, and seed stock. She used a hanging scale with brass weights to issue flour and beans by ounce rather than by handful, and she set a strict sequence for opening jars so older packs were consumed first. Marta built narrow ladder shelves for tinctures and syrups, each bottle nested in cut straw collars to keep glass from touching glass when the wind shook the earth overhead. Ray mixed fresh batches of horehound and pine syrup in a copper kettle, reduced slow so sugar held but did not scorch, then corked the dark bottles with beeswax wraps and twine. She kept 1 locked crate for fever powders and liniments that could not be replaced if rail service failed another month. Water discipline became its own labor. 12 9-gallon casks were no guarantee when 200 souls might need drink, wash, broth, and medicine all at once, so she rigged a hand pump line from the sump trench into a settling barrel lined with sand and charcoal, then boiled each draw in sequence whenever fuel allowed. She posted the fuel arithmetic where any eye could see it. 1 armload of cottonwood gave 80 to 90 minutes of hard boil. 1 of cedar gave less heat, but longer coal. And stove use after dusk must follow lantern extinguish order to preserve draft. She had Marta stitch a canvas curtain between the cook bay and sleeping chamber so children and elders could rest while kettles worked. The chamber was becoming not merely deep, but organized. On the same morning, Gideon Pemberton nailed a handwritten notice to the post outside his store: emergency sales, cash only. Credit suspended except for deed holders and livestock collateral. He read the notice aloud to a cluster of ranch hands and teamsters with the solemn cadence of a civic order, then added that fear buying would be punished by refusal of service. A miner's widow named Elsie Dorn stood 6 paces away with 2 coins in her palm and asked whether lamp oil had risen again. Gideon answered that transport uncertainty had forced necessary adjustment. The new figure was written in thick ink beneath the old one. By the 2nd week of January, mockery that had once been porch talk became ritual. Boys walking from the schoolhouse kicked at the drift walls along Ray's rope trench and called the Root Mole Road. 2 women at the pump, both wearing fur collars bought on store credit, said in clear voices that a respectable town should not let unmarried women run communal provisions as if they were quartermasters. At Wednesday service, one councilman proposed that no public funds or labor should be directed toward private excavations. The phrase delivered with formal care and meant for Ray, though he never turned his head toward her pew. Another suggested that gathering food in one location invited theft and panic, and should therefore be discouraged for moral reasons. The motion passed by a narrow count, not binding by law, but sharp as a warning. Reverend Abel Klein did not endorse the motion, yet he did not overturn it. His cough interrupted him twice before benediction, and he gripped the rail with both hands until the fit eased. Ray remained in the back after dismissal, waiting while families pulled on gloves and filed out into the bitter light. When the last hymn book was shelved, She told him she would continue whether council approved or not. The Reverend answered with visible strain that official blessing had become harder to give than private gratitude in Coldwater. He offered no more. She bowed once and left. Gideon escalated by ridicule dressed as commerce. He set an empty jar in his front window between coffee tins and ribbon spools, tied a black strip around its neck, and chalked beneath it, "Reserved for Ray's grave." Teamsters laughed when they saw it. Two travelers from North Platte asked the clerk what had died. Gideon said with practiced lightness that common sense had been buried on the alkali rise. The line spread before supper. That evening, 3 young men rode past the hatch and planted a pine cross in the berm, rough cut and crooked, with graveyard for groceries carved into the face. Marta pulled it out at dawn and split it for stove kindling without speaking. Ray's answer remained labor and clarity. She held the first of what she called open work hours on January 9th from noon to 4, with hatch ladder cleared and chamber floor swept so any household could inspect the stores and ask about process. 9 souls came, including Ruth Bell and her daughters, a ranch cook named Bess Alder, 2 boys sent by curious parents, and old Jonah Pike from the South Edge cabins. Ray demonstrated brine mixing by weight with a portable scale, showed why cabbage packed too loose, developed air pockets that spoiled from the center, and passed around 2 jars from different batches so everyone could smell the difference between clean fermentation and rot. She explained vent control with a candle and damp cloth, lowering one and lifting the other until smoke climbed straight and thin. Jonah Pike asked what to do when salt ran short. Ray answered that one saved salt first for meat and medicine, and one traded pride before one traded seed. At the same hour, Gideon hosted coffee on his store porch and told a larger crowd that Measured Fear had become Coldwater's newest entertainment. He spoke of rail repair crews already at Platte Crossing, of wagon routes reopening by week's end, of no reason to turn a church town into a burrow. "We are not miners under cave roofs," he said. "We are merchants, carpenters, ranchers, and families. We stand above ground." Several nodded because his coat was fine and his voice was steady. A certainty spoken in broad daylight sounded like truth, even when winter answered otherwise. Late on January 9th, wind fell quiet enough that smoke rose straight again, and a soft thaw began at the surface. By noon on January 10th, the station thermometer showed 42 degrees in open sun. Children ran with coats unbuttoned. Men chopped free the ruts at Main and Cottonwood and said the cold break had passed. Gideon rolled front barrels out onto the boardwalk to signal normal trade and sold sugar by scoop at a holiday smile, telling each buyer that nature corrected itself if given time. The false calm wrapped Coldwater like a blanket too light to feel at first touch. Ray read the same warmth as danger compressed. She used every thaw hour. Marta and 2 Bell cousins drove final cedar braces in the south chamber, where frost heave had loosened one post shoe. Owen Bell helped pin new hinge straps on the hatch door, so wind could not wrench it backward if drifts piled and shifted at once. Ray moved 12 additional water casks underground, each rolled down plank runners and chocked with stone wedges. She added a second rope line parallel to the first from hatch to church, 20 yards offset, so if one line iced over or buried, hands could still find the other. She marked each knot sequence differently by route: 3 tight wraps for church, 2 and 1 for schoolhouse, 4 for town edge, so travelers could count direction even in total white. She checked animals as she worked. The Bell mule refused open ground and kept nosing toward Lee Shelter. Dogs in 3 yards barked at nothing visible and then fell silent together, ears flattened. Chickens roosted early, though sunlight still held. At Cottonwood Creek, the upper ice softened at noon, then boomed hard after dusk. a cracking report that rolled beneath the bank like distant artillery. She knelt and touched the seam where meltwater had run, and then frozen again in ridged glass. It was not the pattern of spring. It was a warning of violent reversal. That evening she found Reverend Klein behind the church, one hand against the clapboard wall, breath short and shallow in the thaw damp. His inhalation powder tin was empty. Ray took him by the elbow, brought him inside the vestry and mixed hot water with a spoon of horehound and pine syrup from a bottle she had kept wrapped in wool. She instructed the sexton on steam cloths and upright rest, then left 2 more bottles and a written measure sheet on the table. The Reverend attempted payment. She refused it with a slight shake of her head and said only that medicine was no use locked in a crate. Night came clear, then sharper than clear. Stars burned close and hard. Frost formed on the inside of window glass by midnight in houses that had stood warm at supper. Ray slept in boots near the chamber stove and woke twice to check draft and ash. At first light on January 11th, the thermometer outside the hatch read -18 degrees. The drop so steep that bucket handles cracked in gloved hands, and breath plumed thick as smoke. Wind struck from the north in long driving bursts that found every seam in every board wall. On the boardwalk in front of his store, Gideon watched the first drift climb the step in less than 10 minutes, while the empty jar in his window rattled against the pane. The jar rattled harder on the second gust, then struck the pane with a sharp glass tap that carried farther than the wind itself, because Coldwater was still in the first minutes of understanding and had not yet begun to shout. By 7 o'clock, the station thermometer read -24 degrees in the shade, and the cup anemometer on the rail post spun so fast the clerk could not call clean counts between bursts. He wrote 52 miles per hour in his log at 7:20, 58 at 7:40, and then crossed out his own numbers when sleet packed the cups and made the instrument lurch. Snow did not fall in flakes. It moved sideways in fine white grit, a ground blizzard lifted from old drifts and driven with fresh ice needles through every gap in board and sash. House doors that opened inward would not close tight against it. Doors that opened outward would not open at all. Ray had already lit both stoves below ground and checked the pull on each vent. The lower intake breathed clean. The high pipe carried smoke thin and steady. She sent Marta Quill up the ladder with 2 wool scarves tied over her mouth and pointed toward the first rope line. Marta nodded once and vanished into a white wall no farther than 10 feet from the hatch lip. Ray followed with a shovel, clearing drift from the marker stake, then tied a second safety loop at waist height so gloved hands could find the line even when the trench filled. By 8 o'clock, the trench walls had nearly disappeared. Only the rope remained. In town, plans built on ordinary winter failed in ordinary sequence, then failed all at once. Potbelly stoves in shallow parlors burned hot for an hour and cold by the second. When coal ran low and draft turned erratic, kitchen pump handles froze upright. 2 chimneys cracked at the crown where thaw moisture had set the day before and frozen hard overnight. At the schoolhouse, snow forced under the eaves and melted across copy slates, then turned to brittle ridges on the floorboards before the teacher could move the benches. The church bell rope froze stiff inside the tower slit. No one rang it. Gideon Pemberton opened his store at first light out of habit and authority, coat buttoned to his throat, ledger tucked beneath his arm as if rules could steady weather. By 9 o'clock, more than 30 souls crowded his floor, boots caked white, hands out for flour, lamp oil, salt, and cough powder. He raised prices again by instinct and announced cash terms over the wind, banging his front sign against its chain. Few argued. Hunger and fear had thinned argument into pleading. Barrels that had looked respectable the previous afternoon were scooped to wood by midday, and the empty shelf spaces he had hidden now stood plain. Long gray planks without sacks, without tins, without the comfort of appearances. At 10:15, a gust struck the south roof seam and peeled back 2 lengths of tarred felt. Snow poured through the gap in a bright slant and landed directly on the stoveplate, hissing once before hardening into crust. By noon on January 11th, visibility on Main Street was less than 1 wagon length, and drifts reached the first-floor sill at the low cabins near Cottonwood Bend. Owen Bell tried to cross from his carpentry shed to the schoolhouse, with a shovel line tied at his belt, and returned with frost, whitening his eyebrows and no feeling in 2 fingers. He told Ruth Bell that the rope to the school stake had vanished under a shoulder-high drift, and that he had found it only by dropping to his knees and sweeping his arms in the snow like a man searching for a grave marker. Ruth took their daughters and moved at once toward Ray's trench with 3 blankets and a sack of turnips. They reached the hatch crawling the last 10 yards, 1 hand on the rope, 1 hand on the child ahead. Inside the store, Gideon's certainty narrowed to logistics and then to survival. His clerk, Henry Lott, climbed to the loft with hammer and nails to patch the roof seam from within, but each board he set tore free under the next gust. The stove draft failed at 1:05 when wind reversed down the flue, throwing smoke low across the room and making eyes water and lungs seize. 20 townsfolk remained trapped there by then, including Elsie Dorn, Jonah Pike, and 2 ranch hands from the South Ridge. Gideon ordered wet burlap over door cracks. It froze in place in minutes. He sent Henry to the rear alley with a line tied to his wrist to test a path toward the church. Henry opened the back door 6 inches and was thrown sideways by snow and wind, so hard he struck the flour scale, and did not rise for several breaths. The door slammed shut on its own. The storm held through the afternoon with no easing interval, no soft edge, no measurable mercy. At 3:40, the rail station clerk abandoned his office after the anemometer tore free and vanished in white, 1 metal arm spinning into the drift like scrap. He reached the church by following fence posts with his shoulder. 2 houses on Willow Row lost stovepipes. A barn roof on the Kidd acreage folded inward under loaded snow. Voices could not carry from porch to gate. Men shouting 10 feet apart heard only fragments and guessed the rest. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped again, to -31 degrees at the station wall where the mercury still moved. Inside Ray's main chamber, the air held near 54 degrees at sleeping height, warmer in the cook bay, cooler near the hatch ladder where each opening brought a blade of cold downward. She set bunks by age and illness, then by exhaustion, and she moved without pause between stove, scale, water casks, and hatch checks. No one was asked for payment. No one was turned away. She issued bean broth in tin cups first to elders with chest trouble, then to nursing mothers, then to laborers tasked with rope runs. Marta kept tally on slate. Ruth Bell wrapped feet in dry wool and changed children's stockings by the stove rail. Owen Bell and Jonah Pike alternated at the hatch, beating ice from the rung edges every 15 minutes so the ladder remained usable. Near midnight, the first death reached the chamber. Thomas Hale, Coldwater's blacksmith, had spent the evening at the public pump beside the livery, chopping ice so 3 households could fill water buckets before their stove fires died. He had tied himself to a hitch post with a trace chain to avoid losing direction when the drift crossed the lot. He broke the final crust and filled the last bucket for Elsie Dorn's nephew, then bent over the pump handle and could not draw a full breath again. 2 men dragged him by rope toward Ray's trench, stopping every few yards to clear snow from his face and chest. He was alive when they reached the hatch lip, eyes open, fingers rigid around the chain link he had carried in his glove. He died on the lower ladder landing before Ray could get the mustard poultice hot. Marta covered him with a wool blanket, and Owen removed his hat. No one spoke for several moments because there was no useful sentence to say. The second day, January 12th, began without sunrise. Light came as a dim whitening through packed cloud and driven snow, enough to mark shapes, not enough to mark distance. The storm kept its force. The temperature hovered between -27 and -30. Drifts reached second-story windows on the lee side of Gideon's store and buried the front step rail entirely. Inside, food was gone except for 3 sacks of cracked corn and a crate of spoiled apples turned soft at the core. The trapped group burned broken shelving for heat when coal failed. Gideon, who had spent years controlling who received credit and when, now rationed splintered wood by a handful under Elsie Dorn's gaze and Henry Lott's cough. Authority had narrowed to keeping fire alive for 1 more hour. In a cabin east of the schoolhouse, Lila Boone had delivered her son 5 days earlier and had not regained full strength. Ruth Bell and Bess Alder had moved the infant to the Bell chamber space on the first night when wind began to press smoke back down Lila's stovepipe. Lila refused to leave her house until she could secure blankets and her mother's trunk, and by the time Owen Bell reached her door at dawn on the 12th, drift pressure had pinned it shut from the outside. He and another man cleared for nearly an hour with shovel in hand, then broke a side window to pull her free. The stovepipe had already collapsed at the roofline, filling the room with soot and cold. They carried her on a door panel toward the rope line, but she did not survive the crossing. Ray met them at the hatch and checked pulse, breath, and pupils by lantern. Marta lowered her eyes and folded Lila's hands over the quilt. The third death came late on January 12th, along the school rope route. Clara Wirth, 9 years old, had been moving with others near the school line when she let go of the rope to search for her brother in the whiteout. A gust dropped a drift wall across the guideline and buried the nearest marker knot. The men with her reached the school stake by crawling. Clara was found 10 yards offline, kneeling against the drift as if braced for one more step. They brought her to the chamber before dawn on the 13th. She did not wake. 3 named souls were dead. The storm had not finished. At first light on January 13th, Owen Bell made the decision that turned the whole town toward Ray in plain terms. He tied a white cloth around his arm for identification, took the church branch line with Jonah Pike, and fought through waist-deep powder and wind gusts that knocked both men to hands and knees. They reached Gideon's rear wall by counting knots and fence posts in darkness at midday. Jonah hammered on the door with a splitting maul until Henry Lott opened from inside by inches. Smoke rolled out low and bitter. Owen shouted through the gap that Ray had chamber space, heat and ration order, and that those who could walk must tie in pairs and move now while the line still held. Gideon stood behind Henry with ash on his sleeve and no broadcloth authority left in his posture. He asked one question, hoarse and direct. "Will she take us?" Owen answered, "She has already taken everyone else." The first group left the store at 10:40. 6 souls roped 2 by 2 with Henry on the lead and Owen at the rear. They reached the trench with 1 fall and no losses. The second group carried Elsie Dorn on a grain sack drag when her legs failed in the drift. The third brought ledgers, a medicine tin, and 1 sack of cornmeal, because habit dies slowly, even in crisis. On the 4th run, Gideon himself took the center rope position, 1 hand on the line, 1 hand on the shoulder ahead, head bent against the white. He crossed the hatch threshold just after noon, boots caked solid, hair rimed with ice, and saw his own window jar on a shelf near the door, empty and clean, now holding stove matches for communal use. Ray did not pause to mark the irony. She handed him a cup of broth, directed him to the water casks, and assigned him to wood splitting with Owen Bell and Jonah Pike. Then she took Marta, checked the knot sequence toward the schoolhouse, and climbed back into the storm for another run. Snow struck her face like thrown sand as soon as she cleared the hatch collar, and she moved by touch rather than sight. One mitten closed on the rope, the other sweeping ahead at knee height for drift ridges that could turn an ankle and cost a life. Marta stayed half a body length behind, repeating knot counts into the wool at Ray's shoulder, so both women held the same map while the white erased every landmark. At the church branch, they found 2 boys and an older woman pinned behind a drift lip against the clapboard wall, their lantern dead, their hands too stiff to grip the line. Ray looped each one to the rope with short hitch ties, placed Marta on lead, and pushed from behind through gusts that bent all 4 adults forward like timber under load. They reached the hatch in 13 minutes by Ray's watch, though each minute spent itself like an hour. Inside, the chamber had shifted from shelter to system. Owen split wood beside Jonah Pike in measured stacks of equal length, so stove feed stayed predictable. Ruth Bell and Bess Alder ran the broth kettles, one thick, one thin, each marked with charcoal lines for ration volume per cup. Gideon Pemberton stood where Ray had put him, feeding split cedar into the secondary stove and hauling ash to the gravel pit in iron buckets, his expensive gloves long discarded, his hands raw and blackened by work he once hired out. Ray came down the ladder, checked heat at sleeping height with a spirit thermometer, and altered distribution order when 2 elders began coughing in the lower bunks. She moved a medicine crate to the warm shelf, set mustard poultice cloths to steep, and taught 3 teenagers to track pulse and breathing by count rather than panic. By midnight of January 13th, 94 souls were in the Jennings chambers, and Ray converted the reserve side room into a second sleeping tier by hanging canvas slings between cedar posts at 20-inch spacing. She showed Owen how to set the knots so weight spread across 2 beams, not 1, then gave him the chalk and let him teach the next row. The distinction between helper and rescued grew smaller with each hour. At 1 in the morning, she opened the seed stock crate in front of 8 witnesses, weighed out only what was needed for poultice meal and infant mash, and sealed the rest again with waxed twine. "If spring comes and seed is gone," she said, voice level over wind and stove hum, "then winter has merely postponed hunger." No one argued. The expensive failures above ground became plain by comparison. Gideon's ledgers, carried down through the storm as if they were treasure, were now useful chiefly as dry kindling sheets. Once names and debts had been copied to a single communal page. The cracked corn that had sold at crisis rates was ground and thinned for group porridge beside beans and venison that Ray had preserved months earlier at ordinary cost. A 10-pound flour sack that had risen above $1 in panic produced less bread than 2-quart jars of beans and 1 strip of smoked antelope produced in planned season. Souls who had trusted storefront abundance over stored resilience could see the arithmetic with their own eyes, and the lesson did not require speech. By dawn on January 14th, the wind had not weakened, but the chamber discipline had hardened. Ray established 4-hour watches, hatch and rope checks, stove and vent checks, water boil and cask refill, medicine and childcare. She assigned Gideon and Henry Lott to outside retrieval on the shortest route, because both men had recovered enough strength and because useful labor was the only coin that mattered. Before they climbed, she knelt by the hatch ladder and drew a route map in ash on the plank floor, showing knot counts and fallback points. Gideon listened without interruption, then repeated the sequence back exactly. On that run, they returned with 2 ranch hands and a crate of wool, losing only 1 lantern to wind. Near noon, the storm finally began to spend itself in uneven pulses. Gusts still hit hard, but pauses opened between them, and in those pauses, voices could carry from marker to marker. Ray used the interval to send Marta and Owen to the schoolhouse line with a sled and 2 blankets. They found no additional survivors there, only benches rhymed white and primer pages frozen together. When they returned, Ray marked the school route closed and posted the count where all could see: living sheltered, missing, confirmed dead. She wrote Clara Worth, Thomas Hale, and Lila Boone in steady letters, then set the slate on the main post so mourning would not be postponed by confusion. On January 15th, under a sky still iron gray but no longer moving like a living thing, burial teams formed at first light. The drifts stood chest-deep in lanes and shoulder-high against the church wall, and it took 6 men with shovels 2 hours to open a path wide enough for a sled. Ray gave out bread, broth, and dry mittens before each team departed, then remained at the chamber table to issue tools and receive names as crews returned. No soul was sent out without a partner. No child walked unroped. By evening, the dead were laid in frozen ground east of the chapel, each grave cut shallow first and deepened as picks loosened the lower layer. Reverend Klein read over them with a voice worn thin by cold and medicine, and Ray stood with the families, hat in both hands, face set toward the wind. 3 days passed before the first message came through from beyond cold water. A rail repair crew had reached Platte Crossing on January 18th, the rider reported, and telegraph poles were being reset in stages from the east. Supplies would come, but not at once. The delay gave Coldwater no choice except to keep living by Ray's measures. She opened instruction hours every afternoon in the main chamber, while food still ran from communal stores, vent placement by prevailing wind, root layering in dry sand, salt ratios by weight, and stove spacing from wall mass, so heat cycled instead of scorching one corner while another froze. Gideon attended each lesson on a back stool, writing notes on scrap paper cut from his own unsold invoice books. The reckoning did not begin as one dramatic speech. It began as a line. On January 21st, after the noon ration, Elsie Darn stepped to Ray's work table and said, in front of 20 souls, that she had laughed when Gideon put the black ribbon on the jar, and that she had repeated the joke at the pump, and that she now understood laughter could cost bread when it silenced preparation. She asked what labor she could give. Ray handed her a ledger slate and asked her to track water draw and boil time. The next day, Jonah Pike came with a similar admission and took the hatch watch without pay. By week's end, 6 more followed, each naming words once spoken and work now offered. Shame moved through town not as performance, but as correction. The public reckoning came on January 28th in the church, after rail service resumed in limited form, and the immediate terror had loosened its grip enough to permit full memory. 211 souls attended by door count, with benches left empty where grief still sat too heavy for some families to enter. Gideon rose first. He no longer wore broadcloth. His coat was patched at the elbow, and his voice carried none of the old merchant polish. He said he had used certainty as a product, mocked preparation as weakness, raised prices while warning against panic, and taught the town to trust shelves instead of systems. He repeated the name Ray's grave and then, with visible effort, called it by the name it had earned, the Jennings Chambers. He placed on the front rail a signed transfer, granting half his winter profit, $312.40, plus his emergency stock rights and rear lot access, to a communal cellar fund under town oversight, not store control. Then he stepped back and did not ask to be excused. Others stood in turn. A councilman admitted he had tabled Ray's warning to preserve appearances. 2 women from the pump said they had equated respectability with denial and repeated that error aloud until it became policy. Henry Lott, coughing between sentences, confessed that he had helped hide empty shelves by turning labels outward while telling customers the supply was steady. Reverend Klein spoke last among them and said his silence at the council vote had been a failure of office, even if not of belief. The confessions were uneven, some halting, some blunt, but each one named both deed and consequence. No one in that church could claim misunderstanding any longer. When the room turned toward Ray, she did not rise at once. She looked across the benches, at bandaged hands, at faces thinned by winter and wakefulness, at children leaning into mothers who had stood watch in a chamber they once mocked. Then she stood and spoke without haste. My mother taught me that food is not a prize for being right. It is a duty in hard weather. My grandmother taught me that a jar sealed in October belongs to a hungry neighbor in January, as much as to the hand that packed it. I did not dig those chambers so anyone would kneel to me, and I will not stand here to collect apologies like debts in a ledger. 3 souls are dead. Keep their names ahead of mine. If you wish to answer what has happened, then build. Learn the measurements. Teach your children to store in plenty and share in peril. If you call that forgiveness, that is your word. Mine is work. She sat. The church remained silent for several breaths. Then Owen Bell stood and asked for her measurements in writing so the whole town could copy them before thaw. Ray nodded once and said she would begin at dawn. The work that followed gave the apology its proof. Through February and March, while drifts receded by inches and supply wagons resumed twice monthly, crews under Ray's direction dug a permanent public dugout on church land. Main hall 40 feet by 20, side chambers for medicine and seed, wall thickness 28 inches, dual vents with iron caps, and rope anchor posts set at 20-yard intervals to schoolhouse, store, and south cabins. Gideon hauled stone with Jonah and Henry, paid standard labor rate, and signed every receipt into the communal account. The old derisive phrase changed meaning in common speech. Building like Jennings came to mean over-prepared, precise, and generous. By the second week of April 1892, Ray opened weekly lessons in the schoolhouse. One evening for preservation, one for ventilation and heat, one for ration accounting. Attendance was recorded like church rolls. Children learned to weigh salt with brass measures before they learned penmanship flourishes. Families built root rooms under kitchens and marked shelves by date. The town ledger, once used only for taxes and disputes, gained a new page each autumn. Communal reserve totals by household contribution and emergency draw rules agreed in open vote. Years moved. Dry years, grasshopper years, 2 mild winters that tempted complacency and were resisted because memory had structure now. In 1901, when an early storm cut wagon travel for 11 days, no soul in Coldwater went hungry. In 1907, fire took 2 storefronts on Main, and the communal dugout protected medicine and seed through the rebuild. Gideon lived long enough to see boys who once laughed at rope lines become the men who set them first at every snowfall warning. He died in 1910 and was buried uphill from Thomas Hale, his estate papers leaving 1/4 of remaining store shares to maintenance of public reserves. 20 years after Ray returned, travelers came off the North Road and asked to see what lay under the Alkali Rise. They descended cedar steps worn smooth by many boots and entered chambers still cool in summer and steady in winter, walls firm, vents clear, shelves labeled in careful hands. Above the lintel, carved deep and repainted each autumn, the words remained: store in plenty, share in peril. Schoolchildren read them aloud before lessons and then carried jars to neighbors too old to pack their own. The Jennings chambers still stand. Coldwater still counts souls. And when first frost takes the hitching rail each October, the town does not ask who was right. The town checks its stores, ties its ropes, and prepares enough for one more household than its own. That October morning, when frost whitened the hitching rail and the ledger clerk sharpened his pencil before dawn, Ray Jennings stood at the entrance to the public dugout with a ring of keys in her left hand and her mother's brass scale in her right, waiting for the households of Coldwater to arrive by family order and weigh what they had brought. The line formed in silence at first, then in the measured murmur of sacks set down, jar crates unlatched, and names called clear enough for the recorder at the plank table to hear. Wheatberries, dried beans, smoked rabbit, rendered tallow, salt bricks, medicine roots, spare lamp wicks, and wrapped seed packets passed across the scale pan. Nothing entered without a number. Nothing left without a mark beside that number. Owen Bell worked beside Ray, broad-shouldered and slower than he had been in 1892, reading each household tag and checking that the oldest jars were moved to the front shelves exactly as she had taught him on the night when 94 souls crowded underground. Ruth Bell and Bess Alder set out tasting spoons and sample crocks at the rear bench, so every new batch could be checked for souring before it was accepted. Elsie Dorn, who had once repeated the mockery at the pump, ran the water ledger now with strict precision, pausing each hour to verify cask levels and boil times against the posted fuel chart. The old social ranks did not vanish, but in that chamber they yielded to task and sequence. At mid-morning, Reverend Abel Klein descended the cedar steps, one careful tread at a time, breath shorter than in past winters but steadier than the year he stood behind the chapel wall without medicine. He carried a folded cloth parcel that held the final pages of the old church donation book, and he placed it on Ray's table with both hands, as if returning borrowed trust. "I delayed speaking when duty required speech," he said, voice low yet carrying through the chamber. "I cannot amend that failure by memory alone. I ask that these pages be copied into the reserve record, so our children see the cost of silence written beside the cost of flour." Ray opened the parcel, read the entries, and nodded once. She asked the schoolteacher to copy every line before sundown. No one objected. By noon, the line reached the hatch collar, and Henry Lott came down carrying 2 items wrapped in oilcloth: Gideon Pemberton's last private invoice ledger and the signed transfer deed that had moved half his winter profits into the communal cellar fund 20 years before. Henry unwrapped both before the witnesses, read the figures aloud, and handed the documents to Ray for the annual verification. He asked me in his final week whether this would still be honored after his name left the store sign, Henry said. I told him I did not know. I tell you now that I should have said yes without hesitation. Ray passed the deed to Owen, then to Elsie, then to Reverend Klein, each checking the seal and signatures. She returned it to the iron box beneath the medicine shelf and gave Henry the key for that lock through next spring. Trust in Coldwater had become rotational labor. Outside, boys from the schoolhouse set new rope lines along the 20-yard posts from church to store to south cabins, not because storm clouds threatened that day, but because October inventory included route drill by rule. One of the boys asked why the knots differed by path when painted signs would be easier. Ray answered in front of the whole group, "Paint vanishes under ice. Fingers do not." She made each child close both eyes, grip the line, and call the route by knot count alone. 3 wraps for church, 2 and 1 for schoolhouse, 4 for town edge. They repeated until they could answer while wind rattled the post caps. The lesson felt severe to newcomers from milder country. The older families watched without complaint. In the late afternoon, after stores were tallied and the final cask sealed, the town gathered in the church for naming and record, as it had done each first frost day since the winter of the blizzard. 3 lanterns burned at the front rail beneath small carved plaques. Clara Worth, age 9, Thomas Hale, blacksmith, Lila Boone, mother. No speech began until those names were spoken by the youngest reader present. This year, the reader was Lila Boone's son, now a broad-faced young man with his mother's jawline and a steady hand on the paper. He read each name slowly, then placed 3 winter apples beside the lanterns. The room remained standing through a full minute of quiet. After the names, confessions were no longer dramatic performances, but they had not ceased. Councilman Jared Pike, who had once voted to table Ray's warning, rose from the back pew and asked permission to read from his original council note. His voice shook on the first line and steadied by the third. "I wrote that preserving appearances was equal to preserving order," he said. "I taught that phrase to younger men. It was false then and remains false now. I request that this sentence be entered in the school civics copy as an error by name." The schoolteacher looked to Ray before answering. Ray said, "Enter it." Pike sat down without seeking comfort. When the church turned to Ray, she did not deliver a long address. She laid her mother's brass scale on the front rail where all could see the worn pans and the etched weight marks. "This is older than me," she said. "It passed through 3 hands before mine. It does not praise. It does not mock. It only measures what is placed upon it. We became safer when this town chose to measure itself the same way. Keep doing that. Keep 1 margin for error. Keep 1 extra shelf for a neighbor." Then she stepped back and motioned for the next instructor to begin the winter curriculum. The response she offered remained practical, and therefore complete. Night had fallen by the time the final class ended, and frost had thickened on the church windows. Ray and Marta Quill, both gray now and moving with the deliberate caution of seasoned workers, walked together to the old private chamber on the Alkali Strip, the first one Ray had dug when the town called it a grave. The original lintel still held, though the entry had been reinforced twice and widened for school tours. Inside, the wall where children once counted jar crates now carried framed copies of the first ration slate, the first rope map, and the first rail report confirming Platte Crossing repair. Marta lit a lamp and placed it beneath the empty jar Gideon had once mocked, and Ray had later filled with communal stove matches. The jar now held winter pencils for the inventory clerk. "That is a better use," Marta said. Ray answered, "It always was." On the morning of January 12th each year, regardless of weather, Coldwater held the rope walk in silence from store to school, to church, to chamber, each household sending 1 representative to walk by touch alone. Eyes covered, knot counts called in a low voice at each post. Those who failed repeated the route until they did not fail. No one treated the drill as ceremony alone. In the schoolhouse afterward, children copied 3 columns from Ray's notebook: temperature, wind, and supply draw. Beside those numbers, they copied 3 animal signs that had preceded the blizzard of 1891. Early geese, high muskrat lodges, restless stock at dusk. The teacher required each child to write a practical response for each sign. Correct answers were specific. Wait and see was marked wrong. When Ray turned 63, the town asked her to allow her name on the council slate. She declined in open meeting and nominated Ruth Bell instead, stating that governance required a rotating hand as surely as safe stores required rotating stock. The motion carried. Ruth took office with Elsie as reserve clerk and Henry as quartermaster under public audit. In that same session, Reverend Klein, now unable to stand long, proposed a final amendment that no emergency price increase above documented replacement cost could be lawful during declared weather crisis. The vote was unanimous. Even the newest merchant, a man born after the blizzard, voted yes after reading Gideon's transfer deed aloud at the rail. Ray died in winter years later, not in a storm, but in her own bed, with dry wood stacked in jars sealed for spring. On the evening after her burial, the town did not close the chambers in mourning. They opened them, as she had instructed in writing, and held the full inventory by lamplight so no task slipped, because grief was heavy. Lila Boone's son read the lintel phrase before the count began. Clara Worth's niece marked the water ledger. Thomas Hale's apprentice checked iron vent caps for ice. The structure held. The method held. The Jennings chambers still stand beneath packed earth and prairie grass, cool in July, steady in January, and marked by the hands of generations who learned that preparedness is not fear, but stewardship. Travelers descend the steps and run their fingers along old knot boards polished by use. Children still learn to weigh salt before boastful speech. Coldwater still counts souls in the ledger each October 1st, then counts jars, casks, cords, and medicine tins before any winter sermon is preached. The town did not become humble in a single night, and not every tongue that mocked ever found words to confess. Yet the work outlived pride. The work taught the town to survive together,